So without further ado, I'm honored to introduce this morning's moderator. Our moderator is Blaire Chisholm, is going to be moderating our panel of city managers. So a little bit about Blaire. She's the Chief Operating Officer at Puni Group. She's also a NAIOP board member, and she is one of our co-chairs of the NAIOP Government Relations Committee. Blaire has been facilitating the conversation around city buildings since 2007 at Puni Group. She leads Puni's planning team and manages their clients' largest redevelopment projects. In addition to being a director with the NAIOP BC chapter, she's a member with the Canadian Institute of Planners, a director of Planning Student Trust Fund, and an active community member for the Bloom Group, which is a nonprofit housing and service provider for the most vulnerable people in need. Blaire is also involved in the Arts Umbrella, a nonprofit center for arts education. I'd like to extend my thanks and a huge warm welcome to the city managers who are planning to join us and to Blaire Chisholm.
Thank you. Thanks, Paula. I'm really happy to be here today, and I'm looking forward to a good conversation. Over the next hour or so, our intent is to gain a greater understanding through the lens of the administrators of our cities about the challenges and opportunities that their communities are encountering. So around development and land use, investment and economic development. And in the end, we're hoping to walk away with a better understanding of how these issues are being addressed by those that oversee the cities where you work and are invested in. I'm grateful to be moderating this session with you on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people. And with that, I wanted to get this conversation started. So let's get these folks up here. So Sean McGill, I'll ask you to come to the stage. Sean is with the City of Delta. He's our panelist with the longest municipal career, having started with the organization in 1989. He's a lifelong resident of Delta and was appointed city manager in 2018. Sean rose through the organization in a number of departments, including engineering, finance and administration, human resources, and corporate services, dealing with pipes, people, and politics, and truly bred in BC with an education backing in commerce and accounting from UBC and SFU. His wide range of organizational experience provides a unique perspective and great insight into the challenges and opportunities in Delta. Sean is most proud of his work to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion at the city and throughout the community. He hosts a series called Delta Talks, which is a take on TED Talks, that are conversations with local Deltan staff and experts about important topics like race, mental health, and poverty. And these are truly inspirational, and I encourage you to take a listen. He's responsible for the overall operational management of the City of Delta, overseeing a budget of $390 million, while providing leadership and guidance to an organization of approximately 1,500 employees. Next, we'll move on to Paul Mochrie with the City of Vancouver. Paul, if you'll join us on stage. Paul was appointed as the city manager in April of 2021. Paul joined the city, though, back in May 2011 as the general manager in human resources and assumed the role of deputy city manager in October 2015, providing oversight in various departments, including fire and rescue services, development, building and licensing, arts, culture and community, technology, and human resources. Paul may not know this, but he is credited in a newly published title out of UCLA called Remaking of the American Dream, which is related to our discourse on the transformation of single-family lots. He's also a board member with the not-for-profit Street to Homes, and prior to joining the city 12 years ago, Paul worked with the BC Ministry of Health and received his MBA from Queen's. Paul manages a municipal budget of $1.6 billion and oversees an organization of over 7,700 employees. And last but not least, if we can get Vincent Lalonde, city manager for the City of Surrey, to come to the stage. Vincent started in Surrey in 1997 and is our longest serving CAO of the panel, being appointed to the role in 2014. He leads an innovative and dynamic senior management team that helps shape the city's strategic and corporate goals. Vincent started in the engineering department, responsible for civil and land development services, and prior to this role, he worked for the BC government's resource management branch and the federal government's Hydrology Research Institute. Vincent is a professional engineer out of McGill and on the board of the Canadian Association of Municipal Administrators, where I also learned about his regard for early 80s movies and music. Vincent is committed to working with Surrey's mayor and council and delivering a thriving city, and leads a staff of over 4,000 employees with a budget of $1.2 billion. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. So I also learned in my conversations with these fellows that the job of the CEO is varied. When Vince and I first connected, he had to step away from a staff appreciation event where he was serving ice cream to well-deserved operations crew. So I thought maybe we'd take a minute to sort of ask you guys what an opportunity to demystify the role of the CAO. And if you wanted to provide a little bit of a description about what you do, what your job is about, and possibly touch on a bit of the role and the interface between you, mayor, council, and bureaucracy. Do you want to go through? Vincent?
Maybe I can start. I think the way that I've always seen it is it's similar to a CEO job. Our board is obviously council and mayor, but we're at the top of the pyramid of the staff. So all the staff report to you, but then you're also, so you're at the thin point of that, but you're also at the thin point of the pyramid above you, in which basically you're the sole employee of council and the mayor, and then they report to all the citizens of Surrey. So you're right in the middle. You have a key role to be able to provide information to council that comes from staff, but also hear from the population. And one of the things that's important and crucial in the role of a city manager is you can't be, you have to flow things through, because there's a lot of information coming from the bottom and decision needs to be made. They need to be synthesized for council to make them. And then once they've made the decision, you got to make sure they're executed. So there's a lot of flow through that's very important to have.
Paul or Sean, did you want to add to that?
I think, Vince, that's a great description of it. Our job is to provide council with advice, the best possible kind of professional advice we can, nonpartisan as well. I think that's really key. The board analogy is a good one, although it's a very interesting board in that the members of the board are competitive with each other. So it's quite different from a kind of corporate setting where you have much more alignment around where the organization is, theoretically at least, where the organization is looking to go. In this case, you're reporting to a board of competitors. So I think to be able to provide advice impartially and be trusted in that regard, and then it's council's discretion to accept that advice or not, and sometimes they don't. And then our job is to support them in implementing that and ensuring that our staff are aligned to deliver on what council is looking for. I think the other role that we play is continuity. So through election cycles, sometimes folks in our position don't survive, but theoretically if we do, it's to make sure that there is continuity, particularly with other parties that we work with at a staff level. We do tons of work with the provincial government, and Vancouver Coastal Health, the Vancouver School Board, the feds, stakeholder groups like this, and to maintain those relationships through political cycles is I think, a big part of our job as well.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add, just to take a little, I agree with everything that's been said, just a little different spin on it. CEOs in our organizations, I think sometimes it's lost the diversity of what we're involved in. We're a very unique organization where we have ice rinks and swimming pools, fire departments, roads, utilities, and I've dealt with lots of people in this room, and we tend to be dealing on development and some utility concerns and development, but it's a small part of our overall portfolio. So I can come from a meeting where I'm talking about contract negotiations with fire and QP, which is going on right now, to discussions around concerns around garbage collection, to how we're going to fund an next soccer field. So it's such a diverse and complex range that we deal with, and I'm always impressed with our staff. We go to council and talk to council, and we have half a dozen staff there that are answering questions across a huge gambit of topics, and they're all diverse, they're all technical. And I don't think you see that in too many organizations, the type of things we do. Big organizations, I have 1,500 staff who are doing very, very different jobs. This summer, one of our challenges was how to get lifeguards. We couldn't get lifeguards, we couldn't open pools. And so going straight from that to figure out the next big development, whether it be multifamily or industrial. So it's such an interest. My day goes fast, and if you talk about typical day, I don't know there is a typical day in our world, because they change very quickly. We do a lot of emergency situations, flooding. We started to have some of our first fires, unfortunately, already. So there's a lot that goes on in our world that probably, until you sit down and talk about it, is not well understood about how much we're involved in.
Great. So managing population of employees from 2,000 to 8,000 approximately, human resources are obviously of concern. I think we are all feeling, a shortage of staff and opportunities for good skilled labor, et cetera. But for yourselves, ensuring you have enough people to perform the functions of the city would be key oversight, obviously. But coming out of the pandemic, I thought we'd get you to comment quickly on sort of what does the future look like in your own municipalities, and maybe a commentary on the work from home parameters that are you're seeing in each of your municipalities. John?
Sure. I can start. So prior to COVID, the pandemic, we did not have working from home. It was discussed. We thought about it, but it really wasn't much of a driver. Like most people in this room, we didn't have a choice when it came. So we have a policy where you can work up to 60% of your time from home. I think it's working okay. It's challenging, and I think largely because of the diverse workforce that we do have. You have front counter staff who have to be there to greet people coming in the door. You have people 2 offices over that are either plan checking or something, and they can work from home full time, and we wouldn't. And so operations staff have to be there. Lifeguards obviously have to be there, and there's a lot of discussion from them on how it would make it fair for everybody. So it's been a challenge. We've upped our IT game by years during the pandemic. And I think there's some more work to do. We had a discussion this morning about staffing, working from home. It can be a challenge. And I think probably the biggest challenge we are having right now is staffing in general. We're not a huge planning department. We've been running 7 planners short. We've had legitimate cases as recently. We show up to interview planners. We're excited we have some good candidates. And 2 of the 3 or 4 we were interviewing that day called in the morning of and had accepted other positions. We're losing planning staff to other cities, to the private sector. So certainly human resources and planning and staffing is a huge challenge.
Paul? Sorry, go ahead, Vince.
Sure. I think, the pandemic all hit us hard. Quite proud that Surrey never shut down, and for good reason. Most of our services, when you think about it, are essential. People needed water, sewer, all those kind of services. Our culture was strong. We did bring in work from home, of course, during the pandemic, but everybody was always touching base back to work at minimum 1 day a week and 2 days a week, depending on what the health orders were. But if there was no health orders in place, we were mainly working from the office. I do believe that, and this is a group, NAIOP, for commercial real estate. I'm really bullish on the office. I don't think office is going to cease to exist. I think what I see for culture in the office environment, and certainly in the city environment, is super critical that we be together. And so I think, to me, when I look at COVID, it allowed us to likely accelerate our flexibility in the workplace. But I think working from the office is super important. So we have a Love Where You Work campaign going on. That's why I was distributing ice cream. And, when I look at the crowd here today, if we're all on Zoom, this wouldn't be the same experience. We wouldn't have had the conversations out when we had coffee before breakfast and all that. And I think our staff are strong because of their culture, and that culture has to be established in the workplace. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have flexibility. The flexibility we're trying to bring is not so much flexibility to, of course, work from home, but more on flexibility of hours and time. And so, the 9 to 5 work week maybe needs to match up a bit more your work requirements of when the work needs to be done. So if you have more work to do on the Monday or the Friday, then do more hours there and then take some time off at other periods of time. So that's where we're kind of going with that. But I was quite proud of staff during COVID, and they've done really well.
You took one of our planners too, which I wasn't very happy about. Paul, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so Vancouver, we did have some experience with remote work prior to the pandemic. We have quite a significant call center operation for 311, and we had a number of those agents who worked from home full time before the pandemic. We had transitioned to that, as well as our IT help desk. So we had a group of staff. We had some experience with it. It has been, in that work environment, has been extremely successful, both in terms of productivity and engagement. So we were able to apply some of those lessons as we went into the pandemic. We've transitioned back to, for the vast majority of our office-based staff, they're in the office some proportion of the time. No one's 100%. in that kind of general office environment. I think we're still calibrating that. It is different by different teams. I think one of the things that we're really focused on is making sure that when we do need staff in the office, that they are there. I know our services center, development services center, we've now made sure that if people are interested to come in and meet with staff in person, that that's an option that's available. Moving to more of an appointment-based system rather than waiting in line for hours as it used to be. So I think we're still calibrating that. The cost of living in the city of Vancouver is a significant barrier for our staff, and we have a sizable proportion of our staff who don't live in the city, and so recruitment retention, when we're competing with these guys and people can work closer to home, with some flexibility, I think is a really significant factor for us, both in terms of recruitment and retention. We're certainly seeing our turnover rate went up pretty significantly after the pandemic. It was historically very low. It's probably around 7 to 8% right now, so not astronomical, but there are certain classifications or occupational groups for sure that we're struggling with, that there's just a lot of demand for in the market. So I think, again, continuing to work on that. We haven't fully landed it yet, but I would agree with Vince. We're not shedding all of our office space. We are rationalizing it, because we are in some leased space, so there's some opportunity in that for us as well, and then leveraging technology. So thinking differently about how we use office space is another part of this. So moving away from I have a desk or I have an office that's mine and I own, to a lot more flexible kind of hoteling efficient use of space is part of what we're working on as well.
Interesting. I forgot to mention that we have 2 mics on either side of the room, and I might stop throughout the conversation to see if anyone has a question, instead of leaving it to the end. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that. But taking on this conversation about office, what we're finding, as you mentioned, many companies are also having to reconsider their office space requirements in light of the evolution of the way we work. So recently, I noted that the office vacancy rate hit 10% in both Surrey and Vancouver. That's something we've not seen in decades. So, excuse me. In other areas of the country, though, we've seen vacancies reach up to 20% in some markets. And I think, like in Calgary, the conversation around converting older office buildings to housing, and some similar in some of the other further east municipalities. But in this respect, I wanted to talk to you specifically, Vince, about the Surrey policy in your CBD around the mixed-use projects requiring 1 FSR of density for office. And so with the conversation in the industry about the drag that sometimes this return and the profitability this has on the mixed-use projects, where we're finding projects are harder to finance and move forward, and inevitably also slowing the supply of housing, especially in the mixed-use environment, with those conditions. Has there been a conversation in your municipality about possibly easing off on that at this stage, when we're really kind of forging new ground in terms of what office is looking like?
It is a very alive conversation right now with council, with the development industry, but I think it's important to give it a little bit of context. So our downtown in Surrey is slated to be, and is, the second metropolitan core, and council is steadfast that a proper metropolitan core is not just residential units. It has to have commercial activity, it has to have a commercial base and an office base. And so when we look at our whole city center, it's slated and right now designated for 75,000 additional units coming in. And we see them. We have a lot. We have about 20 towers on the go right now. So this CBD zone, the commercial business district, represents only 6% of that land. So first, we're not talking of all city center, we're talking about 6%, where council believes there's some merit in having a concentration of office because the area is so big. And within that area, we're talking about only portions of it to be business and office. But one particularity of our downtown is there's been a lot of big box kind of development through the 60s and 70s. So there's quite a few large land holdings. So that becomes very different when you look at that and how you develop that compared to just a single site. But office is a key component. It's been identified with interim uses, and now council's looking at that. We recognize that It is challenging to build an office building now, for sure. And there is vacancy because of COVID. COVID was a drastic change. We went from all being in office towers to suddenly the provincial health officer told us we had to do all the work outside of the office. So 10% is big, but there's a bounce back, and we're kind of trying to see what kind of bounce back there is. But we do believe that it is important to keep some lands designated for office. Because right now we all know that the profitability of residential is quite high and is more challenged in the office environment. Right now the industrial environment is quite healthy, and so we're looking at that because we're also cognizant that you do need development to progress cities. So we're not trying to block anybody, but we're seeing what the sweet spot is so that we don't find ourselves in 5 or 6 years and now there's a big demand for office, but all the prime sites for office are done. But I can't emphasize enough that it's a very small portion of city center, and the amount of development that can occur there from a residential side is huge.
Right. Okay. I guess if at a time where we are, having such high vacancies, and I totally appreciate the point on the 6% of the area that is requiring office, but I'm not sure if if you're able to if there's any tools that you can sort of relax, not all, but possibly some, as we're kind of going through this shift, and do you have those tools that you can kind of use that at a time where it is maybe a little bit more relevant, especially in light of hearing a housing crisis as opposed to an office crisis?
Correct. But again, I just reiterate, there's a lot of residential units being built, but there is flexibility. So maybe I talked about the area. It's a very small area. But also the interim policy that's been in place since 2019, so it's not new. The interim policy called for 3.5 FAR to office on a given site. The densities that are given now by councils, you all know it, you're in the business, they're quite high. So a typical project in that area will get a 12 FAR. So we're just talking about a quarter. So it's not a policy that says 100% office, so it's about a quarter. But it's very site specific. There is tools that can be done. We work with developers every day. They may go into phasing, and also on large sites, each component, does it need the same percentage or not? And those are the things we're working out right now. But I do think there's a lot of flexibility, but it has to be site specific, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Great. Did either of you want to comment on sort of vacancy rates and office environment?
Yeah, maybe, and I won't comment on Surrey specifically, but I do think clearly there's a housing crisis, and we're on that. I think we really have to be careful about jeopardizing our job space to solve the housing. If you look at the region, we've got so much land that's tied up with single-family homes right now. There's tons of land for residential. We need to enable development of that. But folks, if we're going to welcome 1 million people to the region, people are going to have a place to work. And that's critical. And the opportunity to work close to home is such a component of the overall cost of living. And that's one way to get at the affordability challenge. The other problem we've got as a region is if we've got 1 million more people having to travel around the region to get from home to work, the transportation infrastructure implications of that are massive. And if you look at TransLink's plan, which wouldn't be able to keep up with that. So I really think this notion of being able to preserve job space and have that strategically distributed through the locations around the region, as is contemplated in our regional plan, is critical, and not looking at that as the solution to the housing crisis, because we've got lots of other things we can look to on housing.
The only thing that I would add is, and I find it a bit fascinating, and you'll hear probably a lot today, is even though we're all in the same business, our realities are quite different. We're neighbors with Surrey. We have no minimum or required office space with development. We're less than 1% of the region's office space. We have very distinct communities, Ladner, Tsawwassen, North Delta. I tend to hear in Tsawwassen regularly that they need more office space for dentists, professionals, doctors, and they don't have that. So we work with the developers. We have a proposal coming up right now in Scott Row where they're proposing 125,000 square feet of office space, and that's developer-led. So we work with them. We let them sort of test the market and come forward with their proposal, and we'll work with them to understand it. But the realities are very different, where we think we need some office space, and it's being proposed by developers.
That's good to hear. Okay. I guess sort of continuing on this discussion relative to policies, I know that here I'm asking about flexibility in policies, but generally the development industry does like to have the certainty associated with policies. Obviously, it allows them to kind of make some really important investment decisions, et cetera. However, that interface between you and council and some of the different opportunities that council may be presented with and may then come and impact your programs or otherwise with staff initiatives, et cetera, or provincial directions. When developers, they make their investment decisions based on the policies in place at the time. So sudden changes, sort of especially without sort of consideration of grandfathering of existing projects, can really change the economic viability of a project. And so it also creates this reduced confidence in the market. And so I just thought maybe you could comment a little bit about having to balance the needs and the direction that you're provided with the need to create that kind of certain investment environment where people want to call your places their place where they do their work. So yeah, go ahead.
Maybe I can start on that one. I can't agree more. Like Surrey, definitely we do change policies from time to time, like any organization, but grandfathering has always been a big part. And I know I can list of many instances where it's 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, and there's always a consideration for where developments are at. But at the same time, on the flip side, policies are there to improve and better and have basically land use that mimics the times and allows for projects to go ahead. I mean, you can't have a city growing and be prosperous without basically economic activity that's associated with renewal, like development. And so a lot of the policies we introduce are to get rid of maybe things that are antiquated or things that are not suitable to the market. And I think, I don't need to preach to the converted. A lot of the development activity is actually lobbying council to consider exceptions to what's the plan. And then that kind of sometimes forms the basis for relooking at your policies, because if they're good on one-offs, then they should be good for the rest. But, to your main point, grandfathering is critical. Land use, once given, is forever. And so, that's an important consideration. And it's normal that people want to change the land use on different parcels. I mean, that's our bread and butter and business on the development side of the city, for sure.
Again, agree 100%. The predictability and certainty is critical. I think, this type of discussion and the types of engagement that we work with your members on, are critical for us. We went through a pretty significant re-benchmarking of our development cost levies in 2022, got a lot of really, over a course of about a year of working with various industry stakeholders, got a lot of really good input that significantly influenced the recommendations that went to council to kind of phase that in over multiple years and moderate the impact of that. So those things are critical. Yeah, we're pushing really hard to move to more pre-zoning, like remove that level of uncertainty, fixed rate CACs and targets, CACs, density bonus zones, those kind of things where we remove as much risk and uncertainty as possible. I would concur with Vince. We spend a lot of time dealing with advocacy for exceptions. So that actually creates a fair amount of demand. The more that we're able to provide certainty and then work collectively within it, the faster things will go. But appreciate there's always that incentive to then work beyond what the existing policy is. There's lots of incentives to do that. But yeah, I would agree 100%, and that's certainly something we're focused on for sure.
Yeah, and I agree 100% as well. I think that it's vital that that you can come into our office and understand where we're going and how we're getting there. It doesn't change midstream. I can't think in distant memory in Delta where we've actually changed policies to the detriment of development. We are largely going the other way. We have liaison committees with UDI, representatives from NAIOP, Home Builders Association. So we just introduced our first CAC policy, which is very, very minimal. From a fee perspective, Delta's on the extremely low end and very competitive. I think in 2021 through NAIOP, we were the most business friendly from an industrial perspective. And we pride ourselves on that. We pride ourselves working with industry and making sure that we're competitive and it's a place we want to do business. Council is actively, we came from a time in Delta where our council historically wanted to be involved in every level of decision making. We'd be at council tables and they're talking about quality of finishing in units, what it looked like. Noise variances, they wanted to go through council, which is very difficult as staff when you're trying to wait for next council meeting. So to a place where they're pushing us more and more, to delegate more and more to staff. If you look at recently, we have pages of things we delegate to staff to make that more efficient. So the changes we make now are certainly to create efficiencies and move forward. We remove things like units per hectare minimums or maximums. I think we've removed those from, and we're making life easier, I think, and I think that's important. But I 100% agree that having a policy or framework in place that doesn't change midstream is extremely important, and it's not something we would support.
So, yeah, I thought we'd now switch on to the industrial asset class where we're having,
Did someone waving on?
Hey, John.
Just a quick question. With the uncertainty of economic growth we're in, especially as it relates to employment services, you were talking about changes of policy and responding to the external factors that are there. How does the CEO sort of play that role in terms of responding to that external factor to address policy change, to give certainty back to the developing community to develop and create vibrant cities?
I can start answering that and then let my colleagues continue or fill in. But I like your question. Our role specifically will be to be here out. So we do meet with developers, development industry, associations such as yourself. Hear what's in the landscape economically. Hear also what council is hearing from the citizens. Then we basically, staff are creating some technical documents to say, well, you should consider this or that, and here's the mixture. You do some quality control on that, and then you make sure that all this is synthesized in a way that a councillor and a mayor can look at that and spend the 2 or 3 hours they need to look at critical junctions and come up with proper balanced decisions that keeps everybody happy. Ultimately, I think cities are about that, about having happy citizens, but you need the economic sector, you need it all. So our role is kind of, that's what I was trying to explain at the beginning. It's kind of go between, you got to be aware of all the facets of that decision. Make sure you're presenting, as Paul was saying, we're nonpartisan, so we're providing the best technical advice we can within the realization and realm that that's a technical document. Other things come into play when you make decisions. And especially in the political world, it's not just technical, of course. And so that's your role, to make sure. And then the last layer would be to make sure it's timely. So if times are hard economically and certain, for example, some developments or developers may be on the long run, like long game, and then they're talking to you about policies in the long range. Some are coming in your office quite in a panic that they don't know if they're going to make the next month for their development. So you've got to gauge the timing of all this and then bring this stuff in a timely manner.
Good.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. We have professionals in our organization, and what our job is largest too is to hear from the developers, hear from stakeholders, and how things are working, how not working, and staff. It is our job to respond to convey that to council. We put things through our staff to prevent council and different council reports, however it is that we want to hear from industry, we want to hear from stakeholders, and we want to respond accordingly. And council is asking us to do that. They want to hear what's happening. They want to make sure. I actually largely believe we're pushing for the same goals. We actually want good quality development in Delta. We want good quality industrial development, commercial, residential. So we're pushing for the same goals. How do we get there? We're looking at the same challenges from different sides, But I think that, this is probably the tackiest answer here today. It's about relationships and working closely with these groups to understand what your challenges are and how can we overcome them. And it's our job as staff to come up with policy, changes in bylaw to address those and bring those forward to council.
I think, yeah, it's a great question. And I think both Sean and Vincent addressed that. I think for me personally, you asked about what's the role of the CAO or city manager. For me, I do very little actual work. So I can't take credit for handling any of these issues. Teresa O'Donnell, our GM of Planning, is here. We have a fantastic team of experts across kind of all of our technical domains of the city. They do the work. They're the ones talking to you, hearing from you, interpreting that, looking at the considerations. My job is really the 1%, which is how to land that with council and interpret the political staff interface so that we can be successful in presenting things in a way that, as Vince indicated, they can receive and they're getting the full picture, and then it's coming back to us in a way we can implement.
Great. Thanks, John. Okay, let's switch over to the industrial asset class. This is where we're having a completely opposite issue, where the scarcity in the region is nearing zero. At 0.2% was the last number I think I saw. I wanted you each to sort of give us a little bit of insight into what each of your municipalities are doing to facilitate the development of industrial space. So,
I can start. For Surrey, it's super important. Industrial space, for sure. We've had I would say when I started over 20 years ago, Campbell Heights was a big gravel pit that the city owned. And it had been designated industrial, that whole area, but there was not much industrial development there. And that has been kind of the source of a lot of industrial development in Surrey. But the heart of Surrey, Newton, has a large industrial land, as you all know. And so industrial is very critical. It was critical to, again, we were talking about land use and office. It was critical to keep industrial zones when industrial land wasn't as much pressure as there is today, because then those lands in Newton and those lands in Campbell Heights were now reaping the benefit of having the foresight of seeing the importance of industrial. Specifically, what the city is doing around having more supply. So recently, as you probably all know, South Campbell Heights was an expansion area of the original Campbell Heights. There was a lot of heavy lifting done with Metro Vancouver and the regional growth strategies to add that area. It's 120 hectares to that industrial land. And I would say the other one that's very topical, although industrial land prices are at record highs and the vacancy rate is at record lows, which they usually go hand in hand. There is still a lot of development coming through the city that wants to convert industrial land to residential or mixed-use commercial residential. And that's a big thing for council, and it's not always easy to say no to. So again, we talk about plans and policies and designation, and that whole notion, you need kind of a medium time frame to look at land supply and land use, but there's immediacy of developments. So I would say strengthening, we do have an employment land strategy, and I would say that our biggest challenge is to make sure that we stay true to that strategy.
Interesting. I know Sean, you mentioned earlier that 2021 Delta did receive the most business-friendly award for the COB survey from NAIOP. And at that time, the mayor also noted the importance of expanding industrial land. Have you got any sort of news about progress on that relative to since that time frame?
Sure, thanks. And I think to follow up on the conversation and what we can do, I think there's lots we can do and we try to do. I think one of the challenges we have 300 acres of industrial land ready to go with a very high quality developer that we're excited about. Delta is pushing as hard as we can. I'll back up a little bit. The industrial land that we're developing now is industrial land nobody actually wanted 10 years ago. It literally is land we had, I don't know, it was 10 to 15 years ago, land that we could not get rid of in Tilbury Industrial. We sold it for $1. Tens of acres of industrial land that we gave up for $1 because no one would take it, because the cost of remediation at the time was probably around $800,000. They thought that was what the land was worth and no one wanted to take on the risk. Fast forward to now, that all the land that we're developing now has significant environmental challenges, access challenges, utility and servicing challenges. So those lands we're working with now. So we're going through these at the same time as you are, trying to figure out how to move these forward. I think we work very closely with, and I think we talked to those developers, work very closely with them. When you have a provincial government that literally sends you emails to us saying, we will pick that file up in 1 year to look at it, tell you if you have a complete package, it doesn't work. So that's what I think that's one of the biggest challenges. Not to say we can't do things better, not to pawn off everybody else, but we look at some of the utilities and hydro and forest, but certainly from a provincial government Water Sustainability Act approvals that I'm hearing, I've heard stories of 7 years, I've heard 5 years, I've heard 3 years. We're trying to do with Ministry of Transportation. We have a developer willing to build an overpass over a highway, and at considerable expense. I'm sure that continues to grow. But we're years into that process with council waiting to see that come back to council for final readings and move it forward. So that's one of the challenges we have. The complexity of the developments nowadays are certainly different than they were 10 years ago. The regulatory approval process is certainly different. I think we're doing what we can on our end. I mean, I'll talk just quickly about some of the things in Delta. We're very excited in Delta. We've actually done a major restructure. We've actually separated, I think, one of the few cities to do it the way we've done it. Really completely separated our planning and development processes. We just hired, for those here, we just hired formally on Monday, Dorianne Mayhew as our new GM so we have a new GM of development in Delta. And from the second you walk in or submit online, you walk in the front counter, it's all within the same department. We have planning, we have development planners, development engineers, and a process that's much tighter now. Our engineering department is actually reallocating resources just to the development side. So we're doing a lot on our end, but we certainly need help on the other end as well. I think that's where the challenge is, and that's where we have to work together. I don't think it's secret who it is, but you can talk to them and the challenges in that process. And every time we think we cross the finish line, there's some more hurdles that have come up and it's making it extremely difficult. And you can't do business. You can't do business waiting on 2-3 year approvals. I mean, the economic landscape has changed so drastically from when we started these projects to where we are now. It would be impossible to understand where it's going. So I think that's probably our biggest challenge. Again, we can do things better. We continue to work with developers, but I think there's a lot of things that we can't control that are really, really the challenge right now to good quality development.
Yeah, great. I guess there was a question in our committee about this as well, about the Water Sustainability Act, and it sounds like there's some current frustration with that process. Or I guess if any of the other the municipalities, are you sort of finding the similar frustrations with bringing, maybe you could expand on that a bit with the interaction with the province and the Water Sustainability Act.
I mean, it was quite topical for us because the South Campbell Heights, as some of you may be aware, was I wouldn't say contentious, but it was quite the process. But it kind of works both ways. The regional growth strategy sometimes protects lands, but then sometimes if you want the flexibility as a landowner or a developer to change that, then it becomes an encumbrance. So in one way, it enshrines a lot of our growth areas, but mainly when I look at employment lands and people who want, and I know that you represent developers of employment lands in general, some developers may want to, or landowners may want to convert that, for example, to residential. Then there's a step required at Metro, which transcends a local government and goes to the regional government. So that kind of puts the brakes on that a bit. But similarly, we've had frustrations when you want to include land for employment lands. The same process goes both ways. So I think, we work closely with Metro. We understand the different levels. So basically, it's a lot simpler when it's within your own municipality, and then it gets quickly more complex as it goes up to regional, and then even more complex sometimes when it goes to provincial prerogatives.
Great. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, the issue in Vancouver around industrial is quite different. We're not creating it, it's intensification, and again, pushing hard on that, pre-zoning Mount Pleasant to add 2 FSR, and Broad Slopes adding another 1.5 FSR, looking at 2-story industrial with some additional more kind of creative uses on that second floor. So I think the notion of how can we enable that type of creativity and providing some more flexibility around the office use that accompanies that industrial. This is a critical question for the region. Again, looking at what our current vacancy rate is and growth, when we I was part of, and I think other folks in the room may have been as well, part of recent discussions with the port around their kind of long-term planning and the extent to which this is going to be such a major rate limiter on our economy when we've got retailers shipping containers to Calgary and then trucking goods back to Vancouver. It's just a really fundamental problem that we're going to need to wrestle with. So it's an important conversation. Glad to be talking to something other than housing for at least 5 minutes. It's great.
Well, switching to that, it would be interesting, I think, for us to learn a little bit more about how you work as a region, being part of Metro Vancouver, and in terms of the industrial land supply. I think, obviously you have your own tax bases, and then you have to create your own budgets, but then you also have a region that's got the scarcity of industrial and different characteristics of each of your municipalities. Like you said, Paul, with the small bay industrial, like that's maybe more typical of that. And then going out to Surrey and to Delta, there may be larger pieces of land. We also hear a lot of conversation in the industry about, is a single-story industrial building the most effective use of a site that's right next to a SkyTrain station? And then there's a conversation, could you designate single-family homes that are maybe not appropriate for that into industrial land? There's all these different conversations, and so maybe just if you had some commentary on how you work together as a region to kind of reconcile some of those issues. Sean, you get to go first.
Sure. Sure. I'll talk about two pieces. There's two parts to that question. One, I mean, again, the situation in Delta is very different than it is in Surrey and Vancouver. We don't have a SkyTrain, for example. We have the exact opposite problem. We have a real challenge getting good quality transit to our industrial areas. So our council recently supported a UBCM motion to work with the provincial government to come up with a plan to how do we get employees to our industrial centers and to our commercial centers. So how do we do this? We need a more robust transit plan. Delta's always fought for better transit. We have, as a whole, we have a very very permissive zoning in our industrial areas. We don't have height restrictions. We don't have, in most cases in Delta, you can go straight to a BP unless you work in environmental areas and you have some of the DP side of it. But overall, I think it's pretty good. We have two other things I would talk about quickly. The mayor and council started a mayor's investment committee. They want very, very early on in processes. They come in, they meet with mayor, representative council, city manager, our deputy city manager, Marcy Sangrid's here as well, meet with us at a very early part, sometimes prior to acquisition of property, to get a feedback of what would be acceptable, what they'd like to see. We're very open discussions around parking, landscape plans, and I think we work closely with, again, we want good quality development. So the mayor, our mayor in particular is Chair of Metro Vancouver, so very involved in sort of from a regional perspective. But I think that one of the challenges regionally is, again, it's very, very different context, very different challenges. We have a challenge. We have people I deal with all the time looking for industrial land in Delta. That's different, very different than the industrial land that's looking, and the pressures on the land in Vancouver are quite different than the pressures in Surrey. So we do what we can on our end to try and enhance the ability to develop our lands, and I think we've come a long way on that.
I think this region's unique in Canada. All of the other major metropolitan areas are much more, you have metro municipalities where they're not constantly negotiating the trade-offs that we face here. I mean, there is a regional growth strategy that sets a stage or sets a framework for how the region will progress over time. But a lot of the decisions sit within individual municipalities, and there are these types of trade-offs where we're not necessarily thinking regionally about how do we solve the transit problem to the industrial areas in Delta, because Vancouver doesn't care about that. So I think, and talking to cities like Toronto, like that's not a perfect model either, but continuing to think about how we solve regional problems and evolving that governance structure to effectively solve regional problems like housing, like job space, industrial land, transportation. I think we're in pretty good shape on transportation because we have TransLink. And that's something that other regions look at this region as a model. But beyond that, it's a challenge. Metro is it's a board of 40 people, and it's a very challenging governance structure. So I think going forward, that'll be one of the issues I think collectively for all of us is to make sure that regional structure is working effectively to solve big problems. But that's not an easy kind of nut to crack.
Thanks. Sure.
Maybe I'll talk about one part of your question was densification. I think that is crucial. I think two parts. I think we should find new lands to be employment and industrial lands in the region, wherever they're most suited. But the densification of the existing lands is critical. We have good examples in Surrey, in Campbell Heights, for example. Our Walmart distribution center is 9 stories tall. And so right off the bat, that warehouse is more productive from a land consumption than something that is 1 or 2 stories tall. And so that's a great example. And another one is we have a large factory where the parking is on top of the roof of the factory, and the factory is already multi-storied. So, but it has to make sense economically. And we talked earlier about policies. I think it's incumbent upon cities to work with the development industry to come up with innovative solutions to solve common problems. And so you can't be too rigid on your policies. So we would like densification, but we don't force it necessarily in all circumstances. So that's, this one to explain that if you have a willing partner to densify, Surrey would certainly be more than happy to work with you.
Great, thanks. I see there's someone at the mic.
One of the things that we have challenges with in industrial planning is getting hydro. Is there a role for the municipalities to act together to move forward and have hydro delivered in a timely way to where we're trying to develop a regional economy?
Vince,
That's a great,
you want to take that,
great
Vince?
question. And I was just dealing with that yesterday. So we have the same problems. We're building arenas that we're now told that in 3 years' time we can't open because there's not enough power. And we have a long list of issues. So we, again, as the city manager, realize that this affects also our developments, our industrial, very acute. So we actually are lobbying BC Hydro to do better long-term modeling, better planning, more infrastructure. But from an actual detailed thing, I'm trying to get a meeting with the mayor and basically the president of BC Hydro and be concise and highlight the things that are crucial to our economy in Surrey and how we need BC Hydro, organize meetings with the minister where the BC Hydro is part of their portfolio, those kind of things. That becomes in the realm of the city manager. And I couldn't agree more. It's a huge impediment. And, I won't comment on, maybe how we ended up here, but it's an acute, we have an acute demand for power, and we have problems, other problems that I won't mention here because they're not as topical.
But I would add, the simple answer is yes, there's a role for us to play. I think you'd be surprised. We get calls regularly, I need help, I need hydro, can you help us out? We don't have any more pull, I think, or than you, but there's a role to play. We certainly advocate for it. We have, I wouldn't say often, but it's not unusual to face delay claims on our own projects because the inability to get hydro to the site and working with developers. So it's the same challenge for us it is for you. Certainly our mayor has tried from a political level, similar to what Vince talked about, to make some headway. We've tried at staff level. So yeah, it is definitely a challenge for us as well, and certain key areas of development in our city that are challenged with the appropriate hydro.
The scale, I actually have a call with one of the folks at Hydro right after this meeting on the same issue. So again, it's very, very topical. I think the scale, and I only have some sense of Vancouver, but the scale of Hydro's infrastructure plans are massive because again, they're trying to catch up to this demand, not only for industrial, but electrification generally and densification. So it's a rate limiter for residential densification for us as well. We're doing work right now around densifying single-family lots to provide for multiplex. A big issue is hydro and pad mounted transformers, et cetera. One of the issues that we're working on with hydro is we're also a rate limiter for them. So we permit them, they permit us. Neither of those systems is working very well. So we're looking at how we can dramatically change our relationship with hydro to get out of their way so that they can do their work a lot faster. But I think provincially, again, it's another one of these kind of more existential challenges about how we're going to meet demand for power in this province over the coming years.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
With that, everyone seems to have the same problem with hydro. I know they're working on their extension policy now. We've been in a number of meetings with them to discuss how to work better with our industry. Some things have come up about whether the municipal governments would sit together and start talking about how to plan out where you have your OCPGF density, you have a guys for the province and, delivering industrial developments, which we do, we're front-ending tens of millions of dollars worth of hydro and not having guarantees that we'll have that power later on because someone down the lane might use it before we do. So has there been that coordination around that discussion? Because I think that's key. It can't be different for each region because we operate in all of the regions, right?
Thanks, Stacey.
That's a great idea, and actually we're meeting this afternoon. We meet once a month, all the city managers of the region, and that's certainly something I'll bring to the table because this breakfast has been useful to seeing that all my colleagues are sharing the same problem. So we'll bring it up. Yes, well, you're part of our colleagues. So I agree with that. I think we should all sit down together, and I really like what Paul is saying, because that's the other facet of BC Hydro. So there's the power, the distribution. When I look at Campbell Heights, where we have power issues, that was identified as industrial in the 80s. So it's not like new, although the development of it has been more recent to that. But I think the other point that Paul brought up is the permitting. So to put in all this infrastructure, they're going to need fast and efficient permitting. We also need fast and efficient permitting from BC Hydro when we build roads, when we build all kinds of infrastructure. And right now, it's very difficult. And I know some of you have had projects where if you had a transmission pole that you had to raise, it's probably a good business to be in because it's super expensive. So I like your idea. I think we'll bring it up this afternoon as a topic to see if we can get together and do some kind of work group on that.
Thanks. The next couple of questions are about effectively that sort of coordination and ensuring, about the development application process. We all know that you have to go through a number of different departments when you're shepherding through these applications, and find that there are silos within your organizations that still exist. And we're just sort of, I guess, curious about a couple of things here about sort of ways that your municipalities or you might be taking to kind of get rid of those silos and really ensure that staff are empowered to make decisions and move projects forward, but also, I guess, also keeping your staff accountable in essence to a development time process or a timeline to get things in the ground or get projects moving forward. So some comments on that, if possible.
Maybe I'll go first. I suspect as the biggest bureaucracy, we're probably the biggest pain point on this one. So acutely conscious of it. I think all of our leadership understand that. We're doing a ton of work right now to streamline the development process generally. I think that the challenge that we have in Vancouver is just an extraordinarily complicated regulatory environment that developed piecemeal over decades and now is kind of at the point of imploding on itself. So our teams are doing some really, really good work at looking at all of our development conditions and either removing them entirely or dramatically simplifying them and understanding where there's conflicts. So engineering, our development services group, have removed or simplified almost half of our development conditions. So hopefully that's going to be making a big difference going forward. I do think we have some mechanisms in place to coordinate across departments, like single points of contact for complex projects. Our information systems are not optimized in terms of being able to track where things are at, but that's a piece. We're investing a ton of money in technology to support that, both in terms of being able to provide visibility into where work is at from the outside, as well as to be able to track accountability going forward and measure that. Our council is really interested in understanding how long their things are taking, how much of that is on our time, how much of that is on the applicant's time. So a lot of work being done. It is for sure a huge challenge, but I think part of the solution will also be council making some decisions around policy simplification. So we're going back to them with regulations, policy guidelines, where they're going to have to make some trade-offs on outcomes in order to simplify the process. But would definitely acknowledge the issue, and it's one that we're dug in on 100%.
Okay, Vince, maybe you could speak a little bit about the CP program. We're hearing percolating some issues around sort of the timing associated with that process as well.
Yeah, I'll talk about the CP, but maybe I'd like to just add some comment on the processing time, because I think it's critical. So the accountability is very important, and it is something that we hear often complaints about, the length of time it takes, essentially. And so we created a guaranteed timeline program to measure the amount of time that it takes. And then, for example, on a building permit, it's 10 weeks. But you have to understand that when you get a building permit, there's maybe building permit's wrong, but a rezone. So our rezone is 12 weeks, and if it needs changes to OCP, 14 weeks. Now, of course, you're all in the business. Not a lot of project last 12 weeks or 14 weeks, but that's from a complete application. So when you look at a rezone, for example, there's a period of time where it's exploratory and negotiations with the developer. There's a period of time that the developer has to put in to do the technical work, and there's a period of time that the city has to process the said work and issue the permit. So our guaranteed timelines being, by definition, from a complete application, it's a good gauge. And we are gauging, we report every quarter to council on all our metrics on timelines. But one thing that has highlighted is for some applications, it's no problem because they get to complete application quick. What's long is getting to the complete application. So our average is not 12 weeks, it's rather 27 or 32, and that's an average. So that means there's a lot of time spent in the front end. So now we're concentrating on how to change the front end so that it's faster. And of course, we can't be accountable for the time it takes your teams to produce the technical documents. And then sometimes that is an issue. And so now I'll come back to the CP. So the CP program to help by being certified professional. Right now, there is no significant difference in Surrey. We wish there was, but there's not as much as there should be. And there's a variety, I think, of issues surrounding that we're looking at right now, but they fall mainly in two categories. I think we need to take more risks and be less risk adverse when looking at the work from CPs. So that's one issue, because there should be a benefit. That's why you're paying for the CP. But the flip side of that is not all CPs are created equal. We have about 190 CPs, and in order to be a CP is not necessarily a arduous road, and then they're not all equal. So some CP work ends up being not worthy of taking more risks. So how do we navigate that? We're committed to it. We think it should be logically, if you get a CP and the CP doesn't accept more jobs than they can do, because you can also have a very good CP that has too many jobs. But if the CP is able to produce the work and quality work, then on the reverse side, the city ought to take more risks and then spend less time and accelerate the project. It is very topical right now, but we need to do work on both ends. So we're doing the part on the risk, and then we're going to talk to associations about the quality of CPs.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add, I mean, certainly in Delta, it's a bit different, and I can appreciate the challenges Paul has. It's hard enough in our environment, but it's a significantly smaller environment. I can walk across the hall and talk to people and say, this has got to change, right? So when the challenge, when I first became city manager, I would have someone walk into my office with two letters, one from engineering and one from planning, and they did have different information and different requirements that didn't work together, or they would have a planning letter that laid out the requirements of the development, and they're working for it to complete those, thought that was it, and then about a month or two later would come the engineering letter. So we've worked hard to have one letter. We have one letter goes out, it's concise, and I tell my staff, be careful because you're living with it. The requirements have changed quite a bit. We do require less up front than we have in the past, but I think there's a risk to that too, and we talk to developers, if you're going to do a lot of this work up front, and then you get to a certain, they want some certainty with council, they get to that certainty. We've had them come back and say, the servicing this is a lot more than we expected, or whatever the case may be. So there's challenges, and it's finding that happy medium for sure. We don't have a formalized program like Surrey does, but in Delta, under our building bylaw, Part 3 buildings, so your bigger, more complex, larger buildings, the proponent, through their architect and engineers, can actually submit, review, and inspect. So with very little input from Delta, I think is a great process. So the reliance then is on the professional, the engineer, to ensure building code. We largely in those cases become, so we do high-level reviews for zoning checks and stuff like that. We reviewed all the proper documentations in, but really the onus is on is on the developer, and I think it's just a great process and a great program. It probably developed in some ways because many years ago we were almost too small and didn't have the resource or technical capabilities, so kind of evolved from that. But I think it's a great program. So yeah, we're trying to put less onerous. I agree with Vince, a little more risk on our end. And push more back to the development side. We can still do better. Absolutely, we can do better. We still have a legal department that we're now pushing more and more stuff out, and to external legal counsel, because that can be a bottleneck at the end, because everyone gets through a process and they want all the legal paperwork done now. So I think we're just very open to change and very, very committed to finding better ways of doing it.
Great. Paul, did you have a question? No. Okay. We're getting to time. Yeah. Yeah, we are getting to our time, so I just thought we'd give you each a second to sort of talk about cities of the future, to wrap this up with kind of an aspirational comment from each of you about sort of how you see your organizations kind of moving forward. So, can start with you, Sean?
Yeah, I can start, whether it's aspirational or inspirational first thing in the morning, I don't know. But I think, personally, I think forums like this are great. I think that I actually welcome, there's many people in this room I've had coffee with. You're the experts on what you do. I like to think we're the experts on what we do. And having those conversations makes a big difference. Just understanding where the sticking points are. I've had people come into my office with massive frustrations. Once we understand each other, actually, it was a conversation that fixed it. We are working with our staff. Our staff are in a position now, and they're relishing, I think, the idea that someone made the comment about pushing decision-making authority down to staff. They came from an environment where that was not wanted necessarily by council in the past, that really wanted to control all those decisions. And now they realize they have that authority, that if something isn't right anymore, it's not working, bring it to us, let's figure out how to make it, work through that, and a lot more opportunity for that. And I think, I welcome any kind of conversation, any coffee to see how we can do better. I do honestly believe we're pushing in the same direction. We want good quality development. It helps us from a tax base. The project we talked about earlier, 300 acres, talking about 3,500 jobs and I think 4 million square feet total of industrial space that's ready to go that we can't get across the finish line for some of the other levels of government approval. So we got to work together to figure those out.
Just again, big thank you to Blaire and NAIOP for the opportunity to have this conversation. It is really important. I would agree with Sean 100%, is we're all pushing in the same direction. And I think, there is a real inflection point for us right now, having to revisit, given the pressure that we're under collectively in this region, we do need to look differently at how we do business and how we partner with you to deliver the objectives that we're all looking to achieve. And I think that's the spirit that we're coming to it with. It's a heavy lift, but it's an opportunity to look kind of ground up, and that's where we're at right now. So I think the opportunity to re-envision how we work collectively, how we process things internally, again, how we apply technology, that space, there's huge opportunity for all of us there. So it's a really exciting, I think, moment in time, and lots of potential for us all going forward from here.
Vincent?
And thank you for having us. I think I was quite excited when I heard that the NAIOP was inviting city managers here. I think you all play a crucial role. I think the city of the future, it's been said before, but I really believe it. It's live, work, and play. And you represent the work part. And you do development activities or sales, but you're in the workspace, essentially. And I think the city of the future has a good balance of all three of those. And hopefully we don't get to segregated cities where everybody lives in one and then you work in the other. And, you need a balance of all three. So.
Great. Thank you all. That's a great discussion. Thank you, Paula. Round us out here.
Thank you, Blaire, for being a wonderful moderator, and sincere thanks to our panel. Thank you to Sean, Paul, and Vincent. We sincerely appreciate you being here, sharing your insights and thoughts, and thinking maybe this is an annual thing. So thanks again. We are going to be taking a summer break from our breakfast programming, but we'll be back in the fall. We've got an action-packed fall, so look for the golf tournament. There's going to be the municipal roundtables. Again, the breakfast programming. We're going to have our education days. And then there's the cost of business survey, which I know was referenced today multiple times. So that will be coming out in the fall, and we'll see the results of that. And as always, we want to thank this morning's featured sponsors at the platinum level: Cedar Coast, Conwest Developments, Lawson Lundell, Manulife Investment Management, PCI Developments, PC Urban Properties. At the gold level, Altus Group, Bentall Green Oak, Daewoo Group, Peterson Group, Terrell Law Corporation, Trio Vest Realty Advisors, and at the patron level, Blackwood Partners, CDC Construction, Downtown Surrey Business Improvement Association, Morguard, Remax Commercial, and Wales McClellan Construction. Thank you all for spending your morning with us, and we look forward to seeing you in the fall for another season of NAIOP activities. Hope you have a great summer. Thank you.